The 1st of August marks the festival of Lammas, or Lunasa, depending on your tradition, and it's a time of harvests, feasting and giving thanks. Now, the names Lammas or Lunasa are often used interchangeably, although, as we shall see, there is some debate as to whether the two festivals are actually the same thing. Either way, you'll find plenty of Lammas lore online with a casual Google search. But as regular listeners will know, I'm fond of the deep dive. So what's really going on with this early harvest festival? How did people celebrate it in the past? And how can people celebrate it now? Well, that is what we're going to have a look at in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. Welcome to the last day of July, and I can't really believe where this month's gone, but never mind. I've already had 2 weeks off work now and it doesn't feel like long enough. Anyway, that's a complete side issue. Now, this is the last Saturday of July, and like I said last week, rather than looking at another artist for the folklore in art theme, I thought instead we would have a look at the lore behind Lammas, which falls tomorrow on the 1st of August, sometimes also called Lunasa as well. And I just thought this would be quite a good opportunity to have a look at a festival which is actually quite popular in lots of different areas and celebrated in lots of different ways as well. And I thought it would be quite useful because it's quite timely as well. So a lot of the information in this episode comes from the work of Ronald Hutton, and he's an absolute boss at this kind of stuff. So I really recommend checking out his work. The Stations of the Sun is a particularly useful book when it comes to looking at the history of a lot of these festivals and so on as well. And I also used his 2008 article, Modern Pagan Festivals, A Study in the Nature of Tradition, which was published in Folklore Journal. All the references, as ever, can be found on the bottom of the blog post that goes with this episode, so you can see the link in the show notes and you can find them there. So there are quite a lot of references in this one, and that's where you find them. So every time I mention a name, it's because I'm referencing someone. So we're just going to dive straight in because there's a fair bit to get through. And I thought we would start off actually, rather than looking at Lammas, but looking instead at Lunasa. And this one takes its name from the Irish god Lu, who we did briefly look at when we looked at blacksmiths, because he's the god of craftsmen and bards. And also, if you are a Patreon supporter at the £3.50 a month or higher tier, we did do an episode on Celtic deities a few months ago, I think it was now, and we did look at Lu then as well. And if you want to become a supporter and help make sure that Fabulous Folklore keeps going, at the $3.50 a month or higher tier, you would be able to get access to that episode. But anyway, we're going to move on from there. Now, Ronald Hutton notes that Lunasa is, and I quote, the only major ancient Irish feast to be named after a known deity, end quote. And he does remark that there's no obvious reason to associate this feast with Lu, because some people describe Lu as a sun god, but as Hutton points out, he's far more often considered in relation to his huge range of skills. Now, scholars once believed that deities enjoyed worship across the Celtic world, which is where you get a lot of people talking about gods like Cernunnos being this pan-Celtic god, despite the fact that there's only really evidence of his worship coming from small pockets. So as a result, the same scholars thought that there had to be pan-Celtic festivals to go with this pan-Celtic worship. Now, Ronald Hutton points to Mayor McNeill's study of the Lunasa festival, and the whole book is just dedicated to that from 1962. And it was drawn from folklore surveys and medieval literature. Now, it's quite an impressive work. Obviously, she's put a lot of effort into it and she's drawn a lot out of the research that's available. And she concluded that the ancient Celts must have held a festival on the 1st of August, incorporating the same elements as the later celebrations found in her research. Now, she also looked at 18th and 19th century records of open-air celebrations and essentially then worked backwards to sort of say, well, if people are celebrating these in the 18th and 19th centuries, obviously where there's much better documentation, then we should be able to trace this back to this ancient Celtic festival. Now, 78 of the gatherings happened on hills throughout Ireland. 13 were held near rivers and lakes in the North Midlands, and 80 happened near holy wells. And that's quite a wide variety of locations, but MacNeil drew from all of this associated folklore to then create a prototype Lunasa rite. Now this included cutting the first of the corn and taking it to a high place where it was then buried as an offering to Lu, and people would enjoy meals of bilberries and new harvested food, and then there might be a sacrifice of a sacred bull providing meat for the feast as well. And MacNeil also suggested that there may have been ritual dances, plays about Lu, and a 3-day celebration ruled over by Lu's human representative. But there's a problem. The trouble with these is these celebrations weren't actually held across the whole British Isles, and that essentially implies that there was no unified tradition in the 18th and 19th centuries. So without a series of really closely related rituals across the British Isles during this period, it's a bit more difficult to argue for the existence of unified pan-Celtic seasonal rituals in earlier centuries. So that's where it becomes a little bit of a sticky wicket. However, the date was still significant to all of them. So even if people were celebrating in different ways, the fact they were celebrating at that time then still makes the whole thing worthy of investigation. Now, Hutton explains that rituals to celebrate the first harvest could be found on the Isle of Man and in parts of Wales, and even the Hebrides had harvest celebrations, although these were different from those in Ireland. Now, you could argue, obviously, that's potentially also just due to the fact that it's a different place and people have different customs anyway, but he thought it as being different because obviously it wasn't this same ritual that everybody was doing everywhere. So in the Hebrides, people would pick the first of the corn and then make it into a bannock, and then family members would carry a piece of this around the fire while they sang to set up protection around the hearth, and then they would take the embers from the fire and then they would repeat the process around the house and the farmland with the bannock and the embers. And it was all kind of a protective thing. And in the Highlands, people would use the date to top up their apotropaic measures, which obviously, if you remember the episode that we did about home protection, that's essentially what we're talking about. So they would put new rowan crosses over the doors, they would tie red or blue threads to their animals' tails, and they would renew other protective devices at this particular point in the year. It kind of makes sense, really, because this is a point in the year where you've got a bit more daylight, it's a little bit warmer, and it's sort of before the really terrible weather starts to roll in. I know we've been having really terrible weather now, but obviously I'm talking about, kind of pre-climate change. You would obviously have slightly better weather to basically, this would be the time when it would be more appropriate to do a lot of your home protection devices. So if that's Lunasa, what's Lammas? Well, Lammas was an Anglo-Saxon feast held on the 1st of August, and this was to celebrate the opening of the harvest season. And its name comes from Llaeth Mass or Loaf Mass, and it does appear in chronicles, which does provide a really long written record of the celebration, which is quite helpful. Now, for the Anglo-Saxons, the customs involved baking the first of the ripe cereals that were harvested into bread. The church would then consecrate the bread, which was broken into 4, and people would then crumble each quarter of this bread into a corner of whichever barn was going to be used to store the grain. So here you've got both a celebration of the harvest, but also a renewal of protective measures against whatever, and also just kind of to make sure that the grain was all right. But Lammas doesn't appear in mainland Europe on the 1st of August. It's pretty much just the British Isles. So MacNeil assumed that a pre-Christian festival must have existed for the Anglo-Saxons to then decide to hold Lammas at that time. So she assumed that the English must have then adopted Lunasa from their Celtic ancestors. Now, before MacNeil reached this conclusion in 1962, Isabel A. Dixon also referred to the importance of Lammas in Scotland in 1908, and while for her Lammas was central to harvest Thanksgiving, she also claimed its popularity was, and I quote, due to its having coincided with or partially taken the place of an older nature festival, end quote, and for her this festival was indeed Lunasa. Rosemary Morgan also tries to connect Lammas and Lunasa, and this article was in 2004, and she actually claimed that the Anglo-Saxon called the festival Lumas to celebrate Lu, and this name then later got confused with Llaeth Mass or Lammas. So for her, the Christians appropriated Lunasa and its baking of bread. Now, whether Lunasa and Lammas were one and the same is pretty impossible to prove, largely due to the lack of written documentation, but people did continue to celebrate Lammas from the Middle Ages right into the 20th century, and I would argue still do now. And people would hold fairs, they would pay their rents, they would elect officials, and they would also open the common lands up. And according to a Miss Bevan, people in Wales set up small houses that they made of reeds and sticks called lammas houses, and they would light fires inside of these and roast apples, which people could then buy for a penny. So there's still this idea of like celebrating something that is harvested at this particular time. Now, Lammas in Scotland is actually a surprisingly specific thing, and I found a few articles about Lammas celebrations in the British newspaper archives. And in one newspaper from August 1882, a correspondent noted that Lammas was the second of the 4 cross quarter days, and this fell in between Whitsuntide, which we would know as the 5th of June, and Martinmas, which is the 11th of November. And these quarter days were basically the days that were once used for paying rent, although by 1882, Michaelmas on the 29th of September had replaced Lammas. And the same correspondent noted that people celebrated many quaint customs at the time, including the throwing open to common pasturage of lands, and for them this basically referred back to older village communities that would enjoy shared lands, and then enclosure turned these grazing lands into private property. So Lammas was a time to sort of reverse that and go back to the way things had been. Meanwhile, an article in the East of Fife record in 1914 echoed these sentiments, and for them the day, and I quote, has a little or no meaning for the town dweller in the south, but it is an important day in Scotland where it is a quarter day, end quote. And the author then went on to detail some of the Lammas practices from rural England, despite the fact they've literally just said that the name had no meaning for those in the south. And these practices basically included presenting a loaf made of new corn at church, and apparently in Sussex, farmers' wives would actually compete to see who could make the first loaf. Now, reviewing old newspapers from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it does become quite clear that Lammas was a great time for great markets and fun fairs, and this was particularly the case in St Andrews, where one article in 1929 actually questioned the safety of holding the fair in the town streets, and that's largely due to the rise in the automobile. And by 1947, another article from the same newspaper described their Lammas market as being one of the biggest on record, while also noting the way that market day fairs were dying out. Now, at this point, obviously, this is quite interesting to have a look at how people celebrated Lunasa, how people celebrated Lammas. So are they ultimately the same thing? Now, many people do now use the terms interchangeably, and I would imagine in a large part it's because a lot of the popular Wiccan texts do so. But having said that, Scott Cunningham even noted that Lunasa wasn't always observed on the 1st of August, because he explained that it would originally have coincided with the first reapings, which would make sense because obviously you wouldn't want agriculture to be sort of dictated by random dates in the calendar. You would essentially have agriculture following the needs of the harvest. And indeed, some of the older newspapers actually refer to Lammas Tide, which became a period of time in which Lammas was celebrated, depending on the ripening of the grains, not what it said on the calendar. Now, many of the assumptions about earlier witches celebrating these festivals actually come from the work of Margaret Murray, and she was a British archaeologist who, on one hand, did quite a lot of quite important work, but on the other hand, well, I'm trying to think of a polite way of putting it, she drew conclusions that weren't really there, and her reliability has been rather wholeheartedly dismissed by scholars upon further examination. And for me, it is such a crying shame that a lot of the stuff she came out with, yes, it has been essentially debunked, but it continues to be believed lock, stock and barrel by people who then read work that was based on what she said. So it hasn't had that trickle-down effect yet, which is annoying. And Ronald Hutton gives an example that only one accused witch ever gave evidence that she'd ever met other witches on the 4 quarter days to celebrate them. And yet Murray took this single example as the basis for the festival cycle of an assumed religion. So she was adamant that witches celebrated the 4 cross quarter days, but yet she only had one example where someone ever said that they did that. And that, to me, is just absolutely baffling, that you would take a single piece of evidence and go, I'm going to hang everything on this. But anyway, I'm going to try and restrain myself for the rest of the episode. Now, in part, Murray actually constructed the festivals of this supposed ancient religion based on the agricultural year. And this whole assumed religion was believed to be this like old pagan religion that continued to be celebrated like underneath Christianity, if that makes sense. So this religion gave you a witch's ways that were all the way back to the Celts. But having said that, Murray did note that Lammas was an early harvest festival within the church, which is true. But then she said, and was probably the same among the witches. It's so nice to see her being so specific about that. I mean, probably, yeah, we'll go with that, shall we? And she also made the assumption in an article that she wrote in 1917 that, and I quote, "the jumping dance was possibly a fertility rite to ensure the growth of the corn," end quote. And this is why we should have kind of issues with what she said, because in a lot of cases she claimed that she'd read a lot of sources, but then she works in the realm of conjecture, coming up with probably and possibly, despite the fact there's nothing to actually base it on. And it may sound disappointing that in celebrating Lammas or Lunasa, you're not actually following in the footsteps of an ancient Celtic religion, but you are still participating in a seasonal celebration that has been recorded for centuries, even if it does differ across territories, and that is still really, really cool. Now, Marion Green refers to the festival as Lammastide, as I mentioned before with the newspapers, and she basically called it a time of the first harvest, which is fair enough. And the harvest for her finishes properly at the autumn equinox, so this whole period is a time of giving thanks for the things that are being brought in. Now, Green also talks about making corn dollies, which were believed to have been a way to capture the sun's life force. And these dollies were kept indoors and then brought out at sowing time to give the seeds like a bit of a power-up. Now, she doesn't cite her sources, so it's impossible to know where some of her assertions came from. But at the same time, in many of her books, Green does instruct would-be witches to learn about folk customs and practices in their area. And in doing so, she assures them that they'll be able to uncover the old ways preserved in secret and continued in rural Britain, although like they're kind of more just learning about their own heritage, I guess, in a way, which is cool. But at the same time, it does smack of Murray's belief in this ancient religion continued in secret across the centuries. And one of the problems of this approach is a tendency to assume folk practices belong to this ancient tradition, and these practices were then mapped onto the wheel of the year when there's not necessarily any evidence that they should have been. Having said that, in this case where Lammas is concerned, it's actually not an unreasonable assumption, because this is the point when we notice that the days are beginning to shorten, the sun's beginning to wane. Obviously that's in the northern hemisphere, so why wouldn't people give thanks for the first harvest and carry out practices to ensure the health of the crops in the months to come? So all that being said, how do people celebrate Lammas now? Well, Kate West actually refers to Lammas as a time of sacrifice. Now, she does point out that this would have been symbolic rather than literal due to the value of workers in pre-industrial Britain, which I think is a good point. So instead, West proposes that workers would have sacrificed the last sheaf cut from the first field to be harvested, and this apparently took the form of a person or corn king that was symbolically slain and then given to the land spirits in payment for the harvest. Now, West also describes how corn from this first harvest would then be turned into flour and then bread for a great feast. And this was a way for the community to share in the bounty provided by the land. And this custom does have a historical precedent because it's essentially a local version of the church's approach to Lammas. So rather than crumbling the bread to protect the grain barn, the bread is then feeding the community instead. Now, West suggests that people can make their own corn kings, either from corn dollies or made as gingerbread men, and you can then sacrifice them by eating them and give thanks for your own harvest in doing so. Now, you could also give thanks for things like thanking the supply chain that provides your food, or giving thanks for whatever good things have happened in your life this year. So you can take abundance as like this really, really wide thing that can also include other stuff as well. So you might have had an abundance of opportunities, you might have had an abundance of learning, or whatever it might be. Obviously this year that might be a little bit different because of the way 2021's gone, but I'm really hoping that you've had something to give thanks for this year. Obviously I give thanks for my listeners because you're all fab. But anyway, West does recommend baking your own bread, which is indeed an excellent way to mark Lammas. And let's be honest, everyone who made banana bread last year in lockdown, this was your training. You now have something you can make for Lammas. And the thing is, this is a big thing across everything really, that a lot of us are really quite divorced from a lot of our own food production. So if we want to give thanks for our food, making it ourselves is a good way to do it. Personally, I'm more likely to make gingerbread men, or I do have those really fabulous cutters so you can make ninja bread men. So you never know, I might make some of them. But you do have to remember in a lot of ways that harvesting crops was literally a case of life and death in earlier times, because if you didn't bring the harvest in, you wouldn't eat. So celebrating the harvest at Lammas does mean that we can also honour our ancestors and their hard work. Now, as this becomes a time to count your blessings, West also suggests finding a way to give back for what you've received. So one option might be sacrificing your time or effort for the benefit of your land or community, and that might involve picking up litter in your neighbourhood, feeding local wildlife, donating your time or produce to a food bank, or indeed helping to care for communal land. Now, for those living in colonial or settler countries, you might also see if there are land back initiatives that you can support as well. If you want to celebrate Lunasa, Patty Wigington suggests honouring Lou's talents at crafts. So you could celebrate your own crafty skills and maybe craft an offering to Lou in his honour. And she also suggests holding a potluck with your neighbours using produce you've grown yourself, which would be fab if you have an allotment somewhere. Alternatively, you can take your cue from those in the Highlands and work on protecting your home. So on a mundane level, that might mean checking that your smoke alarm works. And I mean, if you haven't done that yet, just do it anyway, because that's really important. You could get your burglar alarm service to make sure that they work, fix any broken locks, and for the love of God, stop leaving keys under plant pots. I mean, I'm hoping nobody actually does that and it's just a thing in films, but it really bothers me when people do it. Now, if you are interested in folklore about home protection, remember there is my free PDF guide about it of 5 methods of protecting your home using folklore. And for the more witch inclined among you, you might want to investigate the practice of warding for home protection. And by far one of the best books on the subject is By Rust of Nail and Prick of Thorn, The Theory and Practice of Effective Home Warding by Althea Sebastiani. So whether you celebrate Lammas or Lunasa or both, have a fabulous time. And obviously, like I say, there's no specific evidence to suggest that they descend from ancient festivals, but they've both got incredibly long lifespans. And taking part in all traditions is still a great way to get involved with your community and your heritage. So find out what local traditions are held near your home and get involved. And remember, folklore is one of the threads that ties a community together, and people made sense of the world around them through their rituals and beliefs. And indeed, this was a wonderful thing that McNeil did with her research, that she was able to sort of trace backwards and at least find these folklore surveys and things in medieval literature that supported the idea of Lunasa. So preserving these old festivals does help us to remain in contact with our ancestors, even if scientific discoveries have rendered some of their beliefs void since then. And also, getting back in touch with the seasons via these festival cycles is also important, because we've become so cut off from the seasons through modern living that it's quite easy to forget that we're part of a larger ecosystem. And these festivals put us back into that ecosystem so that we can help to care for it better. And also, any excuse for gingerbread men, right? Now, that is the end of this week's episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. Like I say, if anybody's sort of sitting there going, oh, but I thought that Lammas and Lunasa were these ancient festivals, I would recommend going and checking out Ronald Hutton's book on the subject and just anything he's written, really, because it kind of situates a lot of things in a historical context, which is fabulous. And he's also got a really, really lovely way of writing as well. And his books are really interesting. And even if you want to take part in one of these ancient traditions, they kind of still are ancient, just purely for how long people have been celebrating them. And they are quite consistent as well over time, which is also very, very cool. If there is a Lammas fair near you, maybe pop along and have a look what it's like. So basically, I just want to wish you a happy Lammas or Lunasa, whichever. Have a lovely time, whatever it is that you choose to do. For the rest of August, we're going to be having a look at the folklore of life events. And this was a request via my request form from Tracy T for folklore of pregnancy, children and birth. And I thought, you know what, that's actually a really good idea for an entire theme, because I haven't really done anything like that. We've done lots of burials, but not really anything else. So in August, we're going to be looking at things like life stages, so like pregnancy, birth, weddings, moving house, all those kind of things and what have you. So that's what I'm going to be doing throughout August. I did also have a request from Deborah Lavelle asking for more information about selkies. I do have a whole episode about selkies, so I will drop the link to that one in the show notes just in case Deborah's listening, so that you can catch up on the episode I've already got. Other than that though, as I say, have a lovely day ahead, and obviously I'll see you next week for our first episode all about the folklore of different life stages. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.